All right, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. So again, you are here at Staying Nonpartisan for 501c3 organizations. My name is Gwen Stembridge, and I'm the Associate Director of Education and Partnerships at Nonprofit Vote, joining from South Carolina. And I'm so excited today for this presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the next hour or so will look like. So this is your welcome. We're glad you're here. We're doing a little overview of the agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about who Nonprofit Vote is. Some of you all might be new to Nonprofit Vote. You may have heard about this through LinkedIn or through Facebook or through any number of other. You may have had an email that was forwarded to you by a colleague or a friend who said, "Hey, you should come to this and learn more." So we'll give you a little overview of who Nonprofit Vote is and the things that we can offer to partners. And then I'm going to turn it over to our speaker for the day. As a reminder to folks, we will have time at the end for an audience Q&A. We'll make sure that we leave time for that. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section of the chat. So I got a little diagram here. For those of you less familiar with Zoom, there should be a little box at either the black bar that's at the top or the bottom of your screen. If you'll put your questions in the Q&A section and then leave the chat for things like your introductions and comments and resources to share. And then, as always, we love encouragements and reactions with this feature as well. So if we're saying things that you like, that you are excited about, yes, I see some hearts. Thank you all. So that is encouraging as well. So we love that. And then just we always end with a call to action, which we'll have there, and then we'll wrap up for today. So wanted to start out here with just a little bit of who is Nonprofit Vote. Some of you all have been attending these webinars for literally years, and you're very familiar with our work. Others of you might be new. So want to just give you a quick overview of our mission. Our work is really all about equipping nonprofits, 501c3 nonprofits, and organizations that are doing voter engagement or who want to do voter engagement. We're all about equipping you with the resources that you need to build a more equitable democracy, an inclusive democracy. We want to be sure that all voices are able to be heard and have access to vote and to be part of our democracy in all of those ways. So that's really what our vision is, right? We want you all as nonprofit leaders, as community leaders, to have the resources and the skills that you need in order to be successful in that. So we're working a lot, everything from food banks to healthcare organizations to housing organizations to, churches and community groups to ensure that you all have the tools that you need. So excited that you're here today. So I'm going to get right to it here. We have this Staying Nonpartisan webinar every year, and we really want to focus on getting you all the resources that you need to do nonpartisan voter engagement. That's a really key part of being a 501c3 nonprofit, which our speaker will get into. I also want to preface this by saying, so Stephanie is an attorney. She is our guest speaker here, but she is not your personal attorney. So she can answer a lot of really general questions, but really want to just remind folks that this is not legal advice, that this is not we're not able to answer questions about your specific situation. So more general questions that can kind of apply to a lot of folks are going to be the best fit for questions there. Great. So I'll introduce here Stephanie Robbins. She's a partner with Harmon, Curran, Spielberg, and Eisenberg. She advises the firm's clients on complex tax laws and processes that regulate their day-to-day activities, as well as setting up and operating corporate structures and their requirements under federal and state law regarding lobbying and political activities. Prior to joining Harmon Curran in 2021, she spent 10 years at the IRS, this is one of the things that we got excited about, and just her sharing her experience directly working with the IRS. So she regularly supported IRS field attorneys with examinations, and the Department of Justice with litigation. With that introduction, also I just am so grateful to Harmon, Curran, and to Stephanie for joining us today. It's always helpful to have that legal perspective and that confirmation that yes, nonprofits can do voter engagement in this nonpartisan way, and it is really impactful. So with that, I will pass it on to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks so much for inviting me to provide this presentation today. We'll go ahead and get right into it. See if I can figure out how to do this. Okay, here we are, staying nonpartisan, operating in what I'm calling operating lawfully in a political environment, shall we say. First, my disclaimers. This presentation is given for informational purposes only. It's not legal advice. It doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. The presentation is not intended to be a substitute for legal advice from a qualified professional. I should also mention that any opinions expressed are my own opinions and not the opinions of my firm, although I won't be expressing many opinions. So here's our agenda for today. I want to answer 4 questions that I'm commonly asked. Those are, what are the requirements of Section 501c3? What is issue advocacy? How can my organization legally advocate for its issues? And can the government revoke my organization's tax-exempt status? Which I think is the one that you all are here for. So, starting off, what are the requirements of Section 501c3? The general rule under the tax code is that all organizations are taxable unless there's a valid exemption. Organizations described in Section 501c of the code, including Section 501c3, generally are exempt from the federal income tax. An organization that believes it's described in Section 501c3 is required to apply for recognition with the IRS. And I assume that many of you are with organizations that have already gone through this process and received their recognition. But the requirements still apply to you, regardless of whether you are applying for recognition or you're continuing to operate under a determination letter that has been in existence for 1 year, 10 years, 100 years. So Section 501c3 has several requirements. First, the organization has to be operated in furtherance of certain purposes, such as charitable, scientific, educational. There's some others that we don't see quite as often, but they're specifically listed in the code. The activities that the organization conducts has to be in furtherance of these purposes and must generally benefit what we call a substantially large charitable class. What's behind that is just the general idea that the organization's activities have to benefit the public. The organization also can't benefit for the substantial private interests. So any private benefit that might result from an organization's activities has to be insubstantial to its substantial public benefit. You could think of this in the context of college education. The students are receiving a benefit from being at the college, but the benefit they receive is insubstantial compared to the broad public benefit of access to this higher education. Another thing that a 501c3 organization can do is engage in insubstantial lobbying activities. So some organizations make an election under the code, other organizations use a specific test, but the idea is that lobbying can't be a substantial purpose of a 501c3 organization. So another thing that 501c3 organizations can do is engage in nonpartisan voter engagement and education. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Getting into the cannots, what a C3 organization cannot do is participate or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. We generally call this political campaign intervention. And a C3 organization cannot engage in substantial legal activity or activity that's contrary to public policy. Let's back up just for a second to something I just said, which is that a Section 501c3 organization cannot engage in political campaign and intervention. Based on this prohibition, you might assume that a Section 501c3 organization can't engage in any political activities. That's wrong. So a Section 501c3 organization may engage in nonpartisan political activity. But what does that mean? What's that term mean? What's nonpartisan? What's political? I find it helpful to look at the dictionary in these circumstances. So if we go just to, I'm using Britannica today, but Webster's would work too. The dictionary term for partisan refers to an alignment with a political party or ideology associated with that party. The term political, however, is a more general term that just kind of refers to politics or government. I see political as kind of it doesn't have a leaning on one side or the other. Now, the term political under the tax code has a more specific meaning. So if we look at the dictionary definitions again, we have the of or relating to government or, activities that are intended to influence the government. The IRS definition of political activity is very, very narrowly tailored to participating or intervening in an election, and that participation or intervention is on behalf of or in opposition to either a particular candidate or a political party. Unfortunately, though, the IRS doesn't really define what does it mean to engage in a political campaign. If we go to the IRS regulations that are under 501c3, looking for some additional information, we get a situation of the snake eating his own tail, because those regulations state that a C3 can't be what they call an action organization. And that term they define as an organization that participates or intervenes in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. There's a little bit more detail there. For example, the regulations define what it means to be a candidate. It also explains that political campaign intervention includes the publication or distribution of written statements or the making of oral statements on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate. But the IRS has issued additional guidance as recently as 2007 that help us parse this out a little bit better. So when it comes to figuring out what is a nonpartisan political activity, the IRS permits organizations to engage in issue advocacy and voter education. Voter education is going to have to be nonpartisan voter education. So you can educate voters on issues, but it has to be a neutral presentation. You can't be advocating on behalf of that issue because at that time, if you're near election, then you're potentially engaging in political campaign intervention if you're advocating for a specific position. It's not always the case, but this is a facts and circumstances analysis. C3s can also engage in voter registration activities. What makes this activity nonpartisan is registering all persons, regardless of what candidates or parties they may be interested in supporting. There's also get out the vote registration is another thing that nonprofits can do. Again, the key is it has to be nonpartisan. You're helping people get to the voter stalls by providing buses, but you're not asking them when they get on the bus, well, who are you going to vote for, and excluding the party that you don't support. And then you can also, the nonprofit, the C3s can engage in what we call candidate engagement. You can educate candidates on your issues. You can have forums that involve candidates where candidates are provided the opportunity to, talk about where their position is on various issues. The key for these types of events is that you're including all candidates, not just candidates from one particular party. And then the IRS has provided guidance on what a C3 definitely cannot do, which generally is support or oppose a candidate, but that can come in the form of endorsing a candidate or supporting a political party. It might be asking your followers to donate money or resources to a candidate or party, or conducting any other partisan election-related activities. These are not activities that can be conducted by a C3 organization. And so we're going to focus mostly on the issue advocacy question right now, because we're not in an election year. There's not, I suspect, a whole lot of voter registration and get out the vote going on at the moment. But Nonprofit Vote has excellent resources that you can look at to get more specific information about, well, what type of voter registration is permissible, what type of get out the vote is permissible. And there should be some links that are dropped in the chat that you can access. What is issue advocacy? So issue advocacy is a term that is derived from federal campaign finance law. The Supreme Court's defined it as conveying information or advocating for an issue, just very generally. Issue advocacy is distinguishable from express advocacy, which is defined and regulated by the federal campaign finance laws. And you may or may not be familiar with this from other nonprofit vote presentations or other sources, but what you're looking for generally in express advocacy is the call to vote for or against somebody. We won't, obviously that's not the focus of this presentation, so we're not going to get into that. Within the context of Section 501c3, issue advocacy is an educational activity. And that's true even if your organization is advocating for a particular position or viewpoint on an issue. I think one way, for me at least, that kind of I use as a touch point for determining if an organization is engaging in issue advocacy or they're doing a more political type advocacy is the focus of the organization. If the organization is focusing more on the issue, that tends to look more like issue advocacy. If it's focusing on the issue with respect to a candidate or political party, that's where we get closer to that. This may be political campaign intervention line. So what the IRS does when trying to determine if an activity results in issue advocacy activity results in political campaign intervention, the IRS is going to look to the facts and circumstances. And in particular, with issue advocacy, the IRS is looking at the method the organization uses to develop and present its views, and not necessarily the viewpoint of the position or organization. So the IRS has provided a useful revenue procedure that tells us what issue advocacy is not, or at least factors that would tend to indicate when issue advocacy is impermissible. So these factors on this slide are, you'll see that like it's factors like the viewpoints or positions are unsupported by the facts. And that's like a significant portion of the organization's communications. Are these just bald statements that really have nothing to support them? Impermissible issue advocacy could exclude the distortion of facts that are supposed to support a viewpoint. There could also be the use of inflammatory and disparaging terms, or expressing conclusions that are based in feeling rather than an objective evaluation. And another thing is that impermissible issue advocacy is not going to be aimed at developing public understanding of the issue, and is not going to take into consideration, what the public may or may not understand about that issue. So if we kind of flip that last slide, we can come up with a definition of permissible issue advocacy. And in general, permissible issue advocacy is going to be objective and supported by the facts. Strong language could still be used, but that language is not going to be intentionally inflammatory or disparaging. And I mean, if you're engaging in issue advocacy, there's probably going to be some strong language, right? Because you're saying like, this is the position that should be taken. It's hard to kind of, I think, personally reach a place like that without having some strong language. And I should note, issue advocacy can become lobbying if you're discussing specific legislation, and also if there's either like if you're doing grassroots lobbying, a call to action, which would be a call to the public to contact their representatives, or if you're discussing specific legislation with a congressional representative or a state legislative representative. All right. And this brings us to the next question, which is, how can my organization legally advocate for its issues? And now is when we get to talk about the current political environment. I have to emphasize that no laws have changed, despite how discombobulated some of us may feel. What's changed is the administration's policy. So in particular, the current administration appears to be intensely scrutinizing the exempt organization sector. based on what appears to be a belief that many exempt organizations abuse the privilege of their tax-exempt status. This focus has distilled into a lot of this focus is on Section 501c3 organizations that advocate positions on issues that are contrary to the position taken by the administration. In some cases, the administration has gone so far as to suggest that those organizations should have their exempt status revoked. But let's talk about our rights here. So Section 501c3 organizations have the same constitutional rights as individuals or for-profit businesses. Meaning that Section 501c3 organizations have a right to the freedom of speech. This includes expressing opinions contrary to the opinions of the party in power. A quote that's often attributed to Thomas Jefferson states that dissent is the highest form of patriotism. I mean, this quote implies that dissent is an integral part of the operation of our democracy. In other words, dissent's a feature, not a bug. However, there are some limitations on the freedom of speech that we should briefly discuss because they sometimes come into play for Section 501c3 organizations. There are at least 7 types of speech that aren't protected under the Constitution. I've chosen 4 that I think are potentially applicable, or at least that Section 501c3 organizations should be aware of. The first is threats against the president or vice president. This exception applies to knowingly and willfully making any threat to take the life of, to kidnap, or to inflict bodily harm upon the president. The actual capacity to carry out the threat is not a required element. So take note. The second is false statement of facts. This exception doesn't apply to any to all false statements of facts, or else like fake news would be illegal. Rather, this exception applies to false statements of facts that may cause harm. So we're looking at defamation, particularly when these false statements are made knowingly or with a reckless disregard for the truth. The third exception is fighting words. These are words which indicate a willingness to fight or challenge someone, or that are likely to cause confrontation. We typically think of fighting words more in the context of a physical brawl between people, but there are areas where it can manifest other than that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And then the final exception that I'm talking about is incitement, which is the action of provoking unlawful behavior or urging someone to behave unlawfully. Incitement and also fighting words sometimes come up within the context of protest activity. So Section 501c3 organizations, as I said, have the same constitutional rights as all others, and one of those is the right to assemble. So there are ways to have a permissible protest. So for the protest to be permissible, the law, it's going to have to comply with reasonable restrictions that are placed by state and local law. Like these restrictions could include restrictions on the time, place, and manner of protest. The organization may be required to obtain a permit if there's going to be a certain number of people attending the protest. Protest activity might have to be concluded at certain times because of local noise ordinances. And if the organization wants to engage in a protest on private property, they have to get the permission of the private property owner. This right to assemble does not apply to assembling on private property. It's the right to assemble in public areas. The organization also should comply with any requests from law enforcement during the protest. So if there's an officer at a protest that's being conducted in the city in front of a building, the protesters may be asked to move a certain distance from the door, for example, or not to spill into the street unless they have a permit to block the street off. Section 501c3 organizations are not permitted to engage in civil disobedience or to urge protesters to engage in civil disobedience. And this would include refusing to obey the demands or commands of law, or resorting to violence. Which brings us to our final question, which is, can the government revoke my organization's tax-exempt status? In recent news, there's been a rumor that the president intends to issue one or more executive orders that would purport to revoke the exempt status of certain environmental organizations, or to designate organizations opposing the administration's policies as terrorist organizations. I will note that yesterday there was a statement out of the White House that no such executive orders are under consideration, with the modifying phrase "at this time." I would take that report with a grain of salt. I don't think that this is the end of the administration's enforcement efforts against nonprofits. But let's talk a little bit about what an executive order is, just to kind of understand what's happening here. So an executive order is a written directive from the president that orders the executive branch to take specific actions to ensure the laws are faithfully executed. It has the force of law within the executive branch, but it can't create new laws and it can't override existing laws. It also can't generally have an effect on private parties unless there is some sort of reach from the executive branch, such as, for example, organizations that receive funding from the government. There's been some reach to them through some of these executive orders. An executive order cannot revoke an organization's exempt status. In fact, the president is prohibited by the tax code from influencing taxpayer audits or investigations. Specifically, the code provision reads that it shall be unlawful for any applicable person, which includes the president, the vice president, employees of the executive office of the president or vice president, and most cabinet level executives. There's an exception for Secretary of Treasury, but so the statute prohibits these persons from requesting any officer or employee of the IRS to conduct or terminate an audit or other investigation of any particular taxpayer with respect to the tax liability of such taxpayer. And this prohibition would, I believe, extend to an order that asked the IRS to examine certain classes of organizations, because that is going to involve particular taxpayers. Moving back for 1 second. So any officer or employee that receives such a request is required to report it to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, or TIGTA. Think of that as the group that polices the IRS. Penalty upon conviction is a fine not to exceed $5,000 or imprisonment of not more than 5 years, together with cost of prosecution. So there actually is a potential outcome for violation of this provision. So if the White House had been contemplating one or more of these executive orders, my hope is that someone in the White House, maybe White House counsel, or maybe it was the DOJ, informed the White House of this law, and maybe we won't ever see an executive order that tries to revoke the exempt status of organizations, but we'll see. I wouldn't place a bet. All right. So the IRS is the only agency that's charged with enforcement of the laws applicable to exempt organizations, including 501c3 organizations. The IRS publishes these documents called revenue procedures. They're official statements of IRS procedure that affects the rights or duties of taxpayers or other members of the public under the code. Why am I telling you this? There's one revenue procedure that's updated annually that describes the circumstances in which a 501c3 organization's exempt status may be revoked or modified. This revenue procedure lists 6 circumstances. Those are the circumstances on the slides. So numbers 2, 3, or 6, like the enactment of legislation, ratification of a treaty, decision by the Supreme Court, and automatic revocation are outside of the control of the IRS. 1, 3, and 4 are within the IRS's control, but we're going to skip over 3 and 4, which is the issuance of guidance, and focus mostly on number 1. So the most common way a Section 501c3 organization's exempt status may be modified or revoked is going to be by examination. This type of revocation is subject to protest and appeal rights, which we'll discuss more in a minute. Another way an organization's exempt status may be revoked is automatically by operation of law. This occurs if an organization fails to file the appropriate Form 990 for 3 consecutive years. And in this case, there are no protest or appeal rights. Instead, the statute requires the organization to apply for reinstatement with the IRS, which requires submitting a new application for exemption. And then there is a circumstance in which a exempt organization's exempt status may be suspended. This also occurs by operation of law. And the trigger for that is the designation or identification of the organization as a terrorist organization. There are also no appeal or protest rights with the IRS for suspension under this code section. Instead, the organization is going to have to pursue other avenues to challenge the designation or identification. Right. So let's talk about how the IRS usually chooses organizations for examination. The IRS puts out what they call their annual accomplishment letter that describes what each of the business units that are responsible for exempt organizations have done during the year. So for tax exempt and government entities, or exempt organizations, you all, we get this nice chart from them, and it splits examinations into 3 different categories. There's the compliance strategies, there's data-driven approaches, and then there's the referrals, claims, and other casework. Compliance strategies are these strategies that are announced by the IRS. In 2024, when this data is taken from, there was one compliance strategy for tax-exempt hospitals, which are subject to a special requirements under 501c that are not under 501c, under 501r, that other organizations aren't subject to. And then the other one related to whether or not an organization had appropriately filed a Form 990-N, which has a filing threshold of the organization has to have under, I think, $50,000 in gross receipts. The second category are these data-driven approaches. These approaches are confidential. The IRS does not publicize them. Basically, what they do is they look at a bunch of data from the Form 990, and they take answers from one part of it and another part of it and compare it to see if they jibe together, basically. And then if there's some inconsistent information, they may commence an examination. And then the third category is the biggest. So we've got referrals, claims, and other casework. Referrals are going to be from the public, from other government departments, potentially from state governments, and also potentially from internal IRS sources. Claims are going to usually be claims for refunds. So, for example, if your organization paid the now repealed 512A7, I think it was, the parking tax, you may have filed for a refund of those taxes when that provision of the code was revoked by Congress. And then other casework, and the IRS describes this other casework as work having to deal with the employee retention credits, organizations that are potentially engaged in abusive promoter schemes or transactions. One common area has been organizations that promote conservation easements. So I do want to look more closely at the data here, though. So look at that. The referrals, claims, and other casework accounts for 80% of examinations. Like that's a lot, right? But if we get down here a little bit more, of these cases that were closed, 1,955, only 87 organizations, the IRS proposed revocation. And that modifier proposed is key here, because the IRS doesn't actually provide data on how many organizations had their exempt status revoked. After the case leaves the IRS, it goes to appeals, and then appeals might decide that the IRS was wrong and not permit the revocation to go forward. So the number of organizations that were actually revoked is much smaller than 87. Yeah, and also I should note, this 87 is actually 4% of examinations, because it should have been based on this number and not the cases started, but yeah, not actual. So the IRS also gives us this very handy chart that tells us the reasons for revocation. Chapter 42 requirements refers to certain excise taxes. For example, an organization that engaged in too much political activity might have their exempt status, revoked under Chapter 42, because there's an excise tax related to that. Organizational requirements would include having articles of incorporation that didn't have the correct language. And I should also clarify too, this is revocations across all of 501c exempt organizations. This is not just 501c3. There could be social clubs or business leagues that had their exempt status revoked. This foundation status thing is not a true revocation, it's a partial revocation. And for this, it's organizations failed to show that they met the requirements of the public support test and therefore were private foundations. And then we have filing requirements and operational requirements. The filing requirements is mostly due to the compliance strategy that we just discussed of seeing if an organization actually filed the right return. So if an organization filed 990N for 3 years in a row and wasn't supposed to file that, they're treated as not having filed a return. That could result in revocation of their exempt status. And then there are other things that fall in this category, such as like organizations that had ceased operating and didn't file, or organizations that had there was a material change in their operation and they no longer qualified for C3. And then the operational requirements this is where the IRS revokes if the organization can't show on exam that they are described in 501c3. All right, now let's look a little bit more at statistically what it means for you all. So if we look at just the 2024 exam data, it seems like, there were quite a few revocations here, right? But there were 1.8 million exempt organizations in 2024. So if you look at the number of exams that were initiated, that's less than 1% of the entire population of exempt organizations. And then if you drill down to look at how many of those cases was revocation proposed, that's close to zero. So if statistics ruled how the IRS picked organizations for examination, then you basically have no chance of being examined. But there are circumstances in which examination is more likely. For example, the chance of examination is higher if a third party refers the organization for examination. And this is particularly true if that referral is supported by information tending to indicate inaccurate reporting or the potential for the existence of fraud. So if your organization receives a notification that it's going to be examined, don't panic. There are processes the IRS will have to follow. During the examination, you're going to be asked to establish that the organization continues to qualify under 501c3. A good thing to have on hand, if you don't, is a copy of your exemption application, because you'll want to be able to show you're operating consistent with what you stated in your application. If the IRS proposes revocation at the end of the examination, you'll be able to go to appeals and appeal that decision. If at the end of appeals, revocation is finalized, then you can go to court. And there's two ways to do that. There's a special provision of the code called Section 7428 that allows an organization to make a request for declaratory judgment in either tax court, the U.S. Claims Court, or the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. You could also go the more traditional route of challenging a tax assessment once the IRS assesses taxes on your organization. So I hope this presentation has given you a kind of a better idea of what your organization can or cannot do and how to stay nonpartisan during these unprecedented times. And I want to make sure we have time for questions, so we're going to go to that.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This is such great information, and I'm seeing lots of reactions here, just affirming that. We have a lot of questions that have been asked. And so I have been working in the background with Travis on our comms team to try to pull out the ones that are the most relevant and try to combine a few. And so we stay on topic here. So just wanted to start out here with this question about working with candidates. So somebody asked about working with candidates and hosting a debate or hosting a forum or something like that. And they were asking if they just posted, just for the Republicans or just for the Democrats, just to highlight those candidates' positions without endorsement for the purpose of education. Could they do that, or would they need to include candidates from both parties or multiple parties?
So candidate forums can be done in a series, right? So you could have a forum that was just the Republican candidates providing their positions. You would have to have a similar forum with, the exact same requirements for the Democrats as well. It takes a little bit more to kind of establish that you've operated in a nonpartisan manner when you do it that way. But you just have to be very clear about the messaging that we're having candidate forums, use that S, and let the public know that the one for the Republicans will happen on this date or this series of dates, or the one up for the Democrats will happen on this date or this series of dates. And as long as everything is, equal between the two types of forums, you should be okay.
Great. Yep. Thank you. This one is kind of two-part here. Someone asked if you could clarify the difference between grassroots advocacy and grassroots lobbying. And I would say just in general, advocacy and lobbying. And they said to clarify, if you're engaged in nonpartisan education about issues and candidates, it becomes lobbying. But if you include any call to action, even a generic one like register to vote. So that's the first part, kind of where, just help us again here with where that line is, and especially if organizations are doing a call to action. And then the other kind of piece to that question is around, does that still apply if the nonprofit does not have staff? If they only have volunteers, can they lobby, or can they do, where does advocacy and lobbying, how does that work in there?
Okay. Yeah. So grassroots, I take as a term that generally refers to you're working with the public, maybe smaller units of the public than you usually would be. The difference between advocacy and lobbying, though, is with grassroots lobbying, you're asking the public to contact their legislator about a piece of specific legislation. So this is legislation that has either been proposed or there's a legislative proposal to draft it. It's, basically legislation. It's something that's going to become legislation. Grassroots advocacy is going to be more issue-based. So there might be, I don't know. For example, like issue-based could be there's a particular tax credit that your organization thinks would be beneficial to the community that you all support. That may not be lobbying if there's no specific legislation out there, but once there is, it could turn into lobbying. So you just kind of have to keep your eye out on what's happening in the applicable legislative unit if you're working on the federal level or on the state level or local level. The lobbying limitation applies regardless of whether your organization has staff or not. Big asterisk, though. So there are two ways we measure lobbying. One is under what we call a no substantial part test. This is a facts and circumstances test. There's very few clear rules here. And that test would take volunteer time into account when you're trying to figure out if you've engaged in substantial lobbying. Then there is an election that the organization can make under Section 501H, and that measures lobbying by expenditures only. So in that circumstance, any lobbying that is done by volunteers is generally not going to be caught up unless you're making expenditures in connection with that lobbying. So if you have staff training the volunteers on how to go talk to their congressperson about this, that may be grassroots lobbying. That would count.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And there was one more question here related to that talks about board members. Are there specific limitations to board members, or does that kind of apply in the same way that volunteers, that it would apply to volunteers?
Yeah, and there's no specific rules for board members. If the board members are serving as volunteers and lobbying on the organization's behalf, then you have, the same issue if it was just a volunteer that is not a board member. Right. But they could do so in their personal capacity, unaffiliated with the organization. So yeah,
right?
Exactly. Like if your volunteer goes out to Congress and decides to lobby, and that's not at your organization's inducement, that's not lobbying activity that counts towards the limit.
Right. Love that. Thank you. The next question here is kind of related here. A couple questions kind of combined here. But what happens when there's issue advocacy on issues that are really should be general and should not be partisan, but tend to be drawn on party lines? This person gave the example of trans rights or a ballot question on a DEI type topic. What happens when that these are technically nonpartisan issues, but they have become aligned with one side or another?
So this is, I think I mentioned it before, like the analysis is based on all the facts and circumstances. So you've got to look at everything that's happening when you want to engage in this issue advocacy, that, tends to be very polarized. Closer to an election, you may run the risk of that type of communication being seen as a partisan political communication. If you're further away from election, then, maybe it's okay. It's really hard to kind of discuss this without knowing the circumstances of the organization and, when it's being done, how it's being done, who they're communicating with. But, there are ways, and particularly if you're staying away from stating the position of the other parties, then it's going to look less like political campaign intervention and more like issue advocacy.
That's helpful. Thank you. Kind of along some related questions here. This person says, given the realities of the current political environment, are there best practices that 501c3 organizations can do to reduce the likelihood of being targeted or risking the revocation of their status? Someone else asked, related, are there words that are considered red flags? They said words such as cultural, racial justice, or Spanish words. Does it mean that we have to change our name or our mission? Or I've heard questions about, our website or statements or things like that. What should nonprofits be aware of in that?
Yeah, so this is something I've been discussing a lot with my clients recently, and there's not really a legal answer to this question. It's more of a question of the organization's risk tolerance. So are you an organization that wants to go out and just trumpet your positions because your positions are valid positions and you have a right to freedom of speech? Or are you an organization that would rather accomplish your mission more quietly so that you're not spending time and resources in defending your position? And that's really, it's up to the board of directors, it's up to the officers. To a lesser extent, it's the employees have a say as well, or at least I encourage my clients to listen to their employees and see where their employees are. Organizations that employ a lot of people that are here on green cards may be less willing to expose their employees to risk in the current environment, for example.
Yeah, that risk tolerance. I hear that from all the attorneys, all the experts that I have talked to, that it really, and organizationally, right? Like how much are you in the spotlight, and things like that are all important things to consider. Great. The next question here is about, actually, I'm going to pull this one about, a couple of folks have asked about ballot measures and ballot issues. And whether that is like collecting signatures for a ballot initiative, or a revocation of an issue. Just when it comes to those ballot issues, what should nonprofits be aware of?
So ballot issues and measures are very interesting because under the tax code, if you have an organization that's advocating for or against a ballot measure, that's considered direct lobbying, because in this situation, the public is considered to be the legislature because they're the ones that are going to vote to adopt this measure or not. Under state law, however, and it's always going to be state law because we don't do ballot initiatives at the federal level. Ballot initiatives are generally regulated under campaign finance law. So you have to, I have a lot of groups that'll come to me and say, we can't do this because it's campaign finance. And well, no, actually it's not for purposes of the federal tax code. You can do it. You have to be cognizant of whether or not there is a requirement to register as, for example, a ballot committee under state law. And that's something, a lawyer that practices political law can help you with. There was more to that question. I can't remember now.
Just can they, so it is lobbying, but
Right.
ballot issues are
Direct
not
lobbying.
necessarily partisan, right? Not necessarily.
Um,
Speak to that, if you will.
yeah, I mean, so there are circumstances in which a ballot initiative could become a kind of wedge issue, I'll call it, for a campaign, like for a political campaign. And then you are treading a kind of fine line between, is this direct lobbying or is this political campaign intervention? And the keys there are going to be generally, you can still advocate for or against the ballot measure, but it needs to be done in such a way that you're not implying that like either an endorsement or a opposition to a political candidate. And this is another area where those facts and circumstances are just absolutely vital. So, this is a good one to take to legal counsel.
Great. Yes. Excellent. All right. We are close on time here. There's so many questions and so many really great questions. So you're making my job difficult, folks, for asking really good questions here. I'm going to round us out with when should an organization consider either an H election or a C4? And what are maybe some resources if an organization is considering either adding a C4? Yeah, talk to us about that.
So the 501(h) election is, I think, a fabulous resource for organizations that have under 17 million in gross receipts. Actually, it's not even gross receipts. The term that the code uses is exempt function expenditures, I believe, because it caps out. So it caps out at $1 million for all lobbying expenses at that point. And then as you grow, that lobbying threshold that you can't exceed, it stays the same despite your growth. So when you get to be that size of an organization, it starts making sense to consider whether or not that election's appropriate for you. But nonetheless, there's still maybe circumstances where it makes more sense for your organization to not make the election. And this is a conversation you need to have with counsel.
Yeah, great.
Something else about that. Yeah.
And C4s, just if there's
C4, that's it. Yeah, C4s can be an excellent vehicle to expand at that point the family of organizations impact on lobbying, because a C4 can engage in unlimited lobbying activity. You have to have the resources, though, to be able to manage two organizations. It can be very complex having these two organizations because it's incredibly important that you observe all of what we call like the corporate formalities. They need to have boards that are sufficiently separate. They need to have officers also that are, sufficiently separate. If the C4 is going to engage in political activity, because they can do a little bit of that, that becomes even more important. And then there's also just like the back end stuff. There are ways to be able to share payroll, but it gets very complicated on the back end. So that's more of a resources question than it is necessarily a legal question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm familiar with that, having been on an organizations that have both, right? It can be really valuable, but that record keeping, whoo, yeah, timesheets and everything, lots of details. So
Brian's asking me to clarify a point here on lobbying. So 501(c)(3)s can lobby. There's just a limit. So under the H election, there's a limit that you calculate based on your exempt function expenditures, and that will give you your total limit, and then your grassroots lobbying is 25% of that limit. It's less clear what that limit may be if you're under the no substantial part test. Generally, we kind of say somewhere between 5 and 15% of your expenditures. Less is better.
Great. Thank you so much. Just round of applause to Stephanie. Really appreciate your expertise and your information today. I know lots of organizations really value this information and helps to guide the voter engagement work. So as you can see from the reactions, you're getting lots of love there and appreciation. Great. And our final couple slides here to just wrap up. I want to remind everyone that this is, while folks like to say that presidential years are the only voting years, I will stand on the soapbox and say that every year is an election year. There are elections that are going on this year, and National Voter Registration Day is also happening this year. You can always register to vote, right, at any time of the year. So this year, National Voter Registration Day, NVRD, is on September 16th. So if you are interested in becoming a partner, we encourage you to do so. It is a free opportunity. You get all kinds of resources. So we'll put that link in the chat, but it's also here if you're a QR code user, you're welcome to use that, but we'll put it in the chat and in the follow-up email as well. Wanted to just also remind you, speaking of how nonprofits are able to lobby, there is a bill called the SAVE Act that I know many of you are familiar with, that puts some, is potentially introducing some restrictions on voter ID that would make it really complicated for folks to get the necessary documents to vote and to register to vote. So you can find out more about that at the links in the chat. And again, we'll include that as well. And we encourage all organizations, especially if you're newer to nonprofit vote, if you want to take the nonprofit vote pledge, this just gets you essentially our resources and access to our resource library, which is completely free to you. These webinars, we've got a whole archive of these webinars on various topics related to voter engagement and nonprofits. So we encourage you to use those resources. Watch those webinars. You can get on your stationary bike, or you can go for a stroll and listen to them, right? And just have that on in the background and get more information there. So we encourage you to take that pledge. And then just want to wrap up and say thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you to Travis, who is putting all of those links in the chat and will help us follow up. And thank you to you all for all the work that you are doing in, as we said, perhaps some unprecedented times, but with you all, we know that we are in good hands with you all as nonprofit leaders who are committed to building an inclusive democracy. So we're grateful to you all, and please do stay in touch. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.